The Devil's Due, a Call of Cthulhu story. The wind was heavy off the river, filling the air with a wet chill that sank into one's bones and wouldn't leave. The overcast sky glowered down on the city, and thunder rumbled over the ocean like some ancient god mumbling in its sleep. The air was pregnant with the threat of rain, and the wan light cast by the street lamps did little to hold back the encroaching gloom. Marlin did his best to keep his steps steady. He held the small leather case he'd taken from the Museum of Wonders and Oddities in a white-knuckled grip, and his gaze couldn't seem to linger in any one place for long. He felt like there were eyes burrowing between his shoulder blades, and every loud noise was enough to make his pulse jump at his wrists and throat. Marlin wished Susan had come with him, but she'd drawn that line already. She'd had his back when he'd cut this deal, and going into that old warehouse once had been enough for her. The warehouse in question was the last one on the north side of River Street. It stood apart from the others, its gabled roof glowering and its timbers bent and twisted by time and the elements alike. The other warehouses had all been turned into living spaces and storefronts over the years, but this last one had made no effort to appear to be anything other than what it was. If anything, it seemed to resent the other structures for putting on fresh coats of paint and false-fronted faces. It was old and ugly, bitter and twisted, and it gave you the distinct impression that it rather liked being that way. The warehouse was, in a lot of ways, like the man who lived in it. Marlin ignored the front door and followed a path of flat, gray stones that led down the side of the building. There was a door there, half hidden behind a thorny bush. While the wood was splintered and the fittings streaked with rust, it opened without a sound. Taking a deep breath, Marlin stepped inside and closed the door behind his back. The warehouse was dim, lit only by guttering storm lamps that hung from iron nails driven into the support pillars. The shadows in the place seemed to move independently of the lamps, cavorting around corners and leaping across the rafters. The air inside was thick, and it settled heavily over Marlin's shoulders. His throat tightened as he tried to take a breath, as if his lungs didn't want to breathe whatever it was that lurked inside those walls. "Mr. Whately?" Marlin called out. A sharp wind buffeted the outside of the warehouse, and off in the darkness something creaked. Marlin licked his lips. He was about to call out again, when a hand fell on his shoulder. Marlin turned, a scream clawing its way up his throat. The man who stood behind him loomed out of the shadows like something from a child's nightmare. Tall and thin as a scarecrow, his hair was a wild, unkempt mane of black shot through with zigzags of ugly gray. His mouth was curled into a fixed smile that showed too many teeth, all of them yellow, and jumbled like the headstones of an old cemetery. The worst was his eyes, though. They were wide and dark, staring with a fixation at something thousands of miles away. They were the eyes of someone who had seen things no mortal man should see. "Marlin," Saul Whately said, his voice far deeper than his skinny chest should have allowed. "Did you bring me what I asked for?" Marlin tried to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he just lifted the case, holding it out in a hand that trembled slightly. Whately took the case and stepped past Marlin toward a desk covered in papers and manifests. Marlin noted idly that Whately's footsteps didn't make a sound. He opened the case and lifted out the stone dagger. The wild-haired man turned the blade this way and that, carefully tracing one long nail over the engravings. "That was the item you wanted?" Marlin said. He'd been certain he'd found the genuine article, but he still felt like a man on the gallows, ready for the trap to open beneath him. "Yes, this is it," Whately said, his too wide smile growing even wider for a moment before it vanished. He was less unsettling with a sober expression, though not by much. "If that's all you needed, I'll be on my way," Marlin said, gesturing toward the door he'd come through. "Not yet," Whately said. He opened a ledger with one hand before spinning it around toward Marlin.
Make your mark, and our deal is finished.
Marlin swallowed hard, but he made himself approach the desk. In the flickering lamplight, he saw a list of names and dates, accounts opened and accounts closed. There were no signatures, though. Instead, there was a strange, brown stamp in many of the boxes. Marlin frowned at it. "Do you have a pen?" he asked. Before Marlin could move, Whately grabbed him by the wrist and turned his hand over. The madman dug his thumbnail into the meat of Marlin's index finger, slicing it open. Blood welled from the shallow cut. Marlin tried to pull his arm back, but Whately was stronger than he looked.
Don't waste it,
he said, putting his own thumb into his mouth and cleaning Marlin's blood from his talon.
Make your mark.
Marlin swallowed, and when Whately let go of his wrist, pressed his wounded finger to the page next to his name. When he withdrew his hand, a fresh, bloody print sat in the book. Whately nodded and made a dismissive gesture with one hand.
Our business is concluded,
he said. Marlin took a step back from Whately's desk, then another. He took a third step, then felt for the door. His hands scrabbled in the dark, Marlin's wounded finger protesting. He found the latch and opened it. As soon as he felt the cold wind on his cheek, Marlin ran and didn't look back.